Hello and welcome, friends. I'm Dr. Davidson. Today I'm here to talk to you about nutrition for kids. It's a very important subject and one often neglected. Today in the news, we hear all kinds of stories about the climbing rates of neurodevelopmental disorders in children, conditions like ADHD, autism, Down syndrome, other serious conditions that have been on the rise. And researchers speculate as to why this is. Some parents blame vaccines for the toxic contaminants in them, like aluminum and various preservatives and previously mercury. However, if we look at the food that we eat as adults and that we feed to our children, these typical foods are actually much greater, far greater sources of all of these contaminants than vaccines, and something we have tremendous control over since we can actually change our child's diet. And by doing so, we can prevent these very serious conditions and improve our child's health. So, I'm going to be talking about a study that was done in children's ages 2 to 7, looking at their diets and the harmful contaminants that were found in some of these typical foods. Their diet was analyzed, and because the thing to note is that because children's bodies are still developing, they're actually ingesting a much higher quantity of food and fluids per unit of body weight compared to adults. So the concentration of these toxins is higher in their bodies if they eat the foods contaminated with them, and they're also much more sensitive to them because their bodies are still developing. So even at low concentrations, these toxins have the ability to disrupt this delicate developmental process and lead to these kinds of diseases. Cancer, asthma, lead poisoning, neurobehavioral disorders such as autism, ADHD, and birth defects are some of the serious conditions and ailments that have been linked to these toxic exposure, and they're very much preventable. The good news is that changing the diet can actually reduce levels of exposure to these toxins and prevent these conditions. So, as one researcher explained, a diet high in fish and animal products, for example, results in greater exposure to persistent dangerous pollutants like DDT, an insecticide like dihydrin, dioxins, heavy metals, and basically by switching to a whole food plant-based diet, we can uh, we can avoid these compounds. The dangerous thing about these compounds is that they bioaccumulate up the food chain, meaning that as smaller animals are eaten by larger animals and so on, these compounds increase in concentration. So the larger animals, those at the top of the food chain, have the greatest concentrations. And since really humans are at the very top of the food chain and eat these animals, we actually ingest the greatest quantities. Now, it's a particular concern to children because, if fed these animals, they again are still developing, and these toxins can really interfere with that process, leading to some of these serious conditions. The other thing to note is that some of these toxins, like dioxin, have a very long half life, so it would take many years to even clear out just half the amount in the body, while they're still continuing to do damage during that time. And the study found that these kids were not eating from the bottom of the food chain at all. In other words, they were not eating plants like vegetables, fruits, etc. The cancer benchmarks were exceeded by all 364 children in the study for arsenic, a banned pesticide called dieldrin, a metabolite of DDT called DDE, and dioxins as well. Um, so children exceeded the safety levels for all toxins by a greater margin than adults. And because these toxins are suspected endocrine disruptors, in other words, they interfere with hormonal development, they do interfere with normal child development and can cause serious neurological and developmental disorders. And even autoimmune conditions like that can lead to diabetes, obesity, autoimmune conditions like psoriasis. And in the study, the cancer risk ratios were exceeded by over a factor of 100 for arsenic and dioxins in the study. So, in other words, the risk of cancer due to exposure from arsenic and dioxins was so the safe limit for those pollutants was exceeded by hundredfold, which is quite significant. So Which foods are the most contaminated? Well, the study found that for preschoolers, the number one food source of arsenic was poultry, though it was tuna for their parents. The number one source for lead was dairy. The number one source for mercury was seafood. And the number one source for banned pesticides and dioxins was, again, dairy. Now, as a side note, men had higher levels of some of these pollutants than women, as shown in a similar study in Europe. Um, Interestingly, if you only looked at women who never breastfed, their levels were on par with those of men. And women who breastfed for over a year had the lowest levels. So why do you think that is? As one researcher points out, it's likely that the lactation-related reduction in blood pollutant levels, partly explains lower body burdens among women compared with men. In other words, um, cows excrete some of these toxins into their milk, and then we drink it. And unfortunately, human mothers can do the same thing with their children when they breastfeed. So basically, the mother is getting rid of these pollutants through lactation, and unfortunately, the baby is actually consuming that milk and inadvertently ingesting those toxins along with it. Beyond being considered carcinogenic, these pollutants have a number of other detrimental health effects. They can affect, for instance, the immune system. One researcher notes studies clearly demonstrate the ability of dioxins and other compounds related to have a long-lasting and damaging impact on immune function. This translates into increased incidence of respiratory infections, coughs, and sore throats. The studies indicate that the immunosuppressive effects of these toxins may persist from infancy into early childhood. These pollutants can accumulate in animal fat, and therefore the researchers concluded that a whole food plant-based diet consisting of legumes, fruits, nuts, seeds, vegetables, beans, peas, etc., can actually reduce significantly exposure for both children and adults. So basically, the solution is quite simple. Um, get your child on a whole food plant based diet. And I'm going to be talking later about strategies we can employ to get kids to like eating healthy foods, like eating their carrots or broccoli, their veggies, etc. Um, and of course, it's very important that parents model this behavior for their children and serve as role models because obviously kids tend to mimic their parents. So I encourage you all today to apply this information and see how you can change your diet to be more plant based. Basically looking at unrefined, unprocessed, whole plant foods, and if possible, to completely eliminate these animal products, which are all very significant sources of these pollutants mentioned in the study discussed. So thank you very much. I'm Dr. Davidson, and this has been a presentation in collaboration with Stella McCarter.